Okay. Yes, so today we're going to talk about how we think, and we're going to specifically talk about creative thinking and the opposite to it, which I'm calling deductive or analytical thinking, and about how we need both of these in order to think in a balanced way that's optimal for our well-being. And we make about 35,000 decisions a day. Now, some of these are pretty minor kind of choices, like what clothes to put on and that kind of thing, whether we're going to have more than one cup of coffee or not. And during our waking hours, that means we're making a decision every couple of seconds. And some of these are obviously very, what we call system one thinking, which is really very automated kind of process that I'll get into in a second. And some of these are less so. But in general, if we're talking about making sort of day-to-day kind of decisions, what our brain does is to scurry off to see if we've made a similar kind of decision previously. So, if we're in the grocery store and we suddenly realize we want some more granola, and there's like five choices in front of us, then the subconscious will disappear into its memory banks, and it'll just in a fraction of a second or a second of that sort of order, it'll kind of go through and say, no, that one's more like building material. No, that one's too expensive. This is the one we choose. Yes. Okay. And so it'll base what we do on previously what we've had, but it'll do it in an incredibly quick kind of non-analytical way. There's nothing particularly creative about it, but it sets the stage for what we make in bigger decisions, which if we're, for instance, deciding to buy a new car or something even more dramatic, like whether or not we've just got a good, splendid job offer, but it happens to be, several hundred miles away. And so, there's a lot of moving parts to that kind of decision. So we're not going to find anything back in our memory banks that fits that particularly well. So what tends to happen there is that we go into a process of using as many small bits that we had previously. But basically, in that situation, you're really stuck with using creative thinking. So less serious types of decision that we make with these pre-written scripts that we've dragged out of our memory banks, that tends to be totally lacking in creativity. We're literally kind of pressing the mixture as before button. And then we go into analytical thinking, because we've got to think about how that pre-written script actually fits in with what the problem is today. So that's kind of the way that system sort of works. The pre-written scripts, by the way, save a phenomenal amount of energy, and our brains are pre-wired to be the ultimate energy-saving machine. I mean, when we're thinking about things in a more creative way, such as I've been offered this great job, blah, 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 that can use as much energy as going for a stroll. So you can imagine, sort of by the time you've spent your morning thinking of doing that, you have a right to feel sort of pretty exhausted. On the other hand, anyway, our brains use about 20% of the body's energy. Now, when you think about all the other bits and pieces that have muscles that move and all this kind of stuff, I think it's a pretty staggering kind of amount of energy to be using. So we've got all sorts of reasons to try and minimize the amount of energy we use. And one of those ways is by using these pre-written scripts. We're also really bombarded with encouragement to make us think in this deductive way. Everywhere we look, we open the mail and there's a card telling us we need water main insurance, otherwise it'll cost us $3,000 if we have a leak, or switch on the TV and we've got other insurance, we've got people try and make us scared because we don't have enough for retirement, or there's pharmaceuticals suggesting perhaps we've got some illness that we never even realized we had. And so we've got all of those types of things are trying to stimulate our deductive analytical mind. In other words, sort of this solution in this hand and this solution in this hand, and which side of the scales is heaviest. So that's the kind of thinking that we're talking about then. So all of these encourage a kind of a pro and cons list type of thinking. You've probably had the same thing. I've had coaching clients who have sort of decided to leave their partner because on the con side of the scales there was more weight than on the pro side of the scales for staying with them. So, this is this kind of mechanism that was used to leave your partner. Now, if you think about it, sort of in the cold light of day, that's rather missing the point, isn't it? I mean, if you're sort of planning to be with somebody, I mean, you've either got this totally non-deductive analytical bit called love that comes into play, and that gets completely missed if we're looking at pros and cons on a scale. So there's clearly something missing if we're always using pros and cons lists. And I'm not criticizing my client or analytical thinking. We need that. But all I'm saying is that it shouldn't be the only way of thinking that we have in our toolbox. Now, I built a house when I lived in Portugal, and it was one of my things on my bucket list was to design it and build it. And I designed it using the principles of Sthapatya Veda. And I don't know if you've ever come across that. It's not a well-known Veda, but you've probably all come across Ayurveda, the Vedic science of, it's really the interface between the mind and the body. You go to a Vedic doctor, an Ayurvedic doctor, and he's as likely to tell you, well, first of all, he's going to give you some disgusting medicine. If it's not totally disgusting, then it's not a true Ayurvedic medicine. But it'll be some sort of natural thing which can could come from seeds or berries, or indeed it could be dried cow pee. There's all sorts of different things that go into this stuff. But he's as likely to tell you, oh, Andre, you shouldn't be wearing that color. Oh, really? Yes, you have to change your shirt. You must use a different color. And so, there's all sorts of things that go about. But the thing is that this is the oldest medical system around, and it dates back 5,000 years. Now, just have a think about it for a second. They had Vedas for architecture, for the living spaces to be comfortable, that went off to become Feng Shui. That's Sthapatya Veda, and Vedas for every part of your life, including meditation. Now, when you then have a look at the fact that the first time anybody really examined the notion of gravity, which, let's face it, is a sort of very fundamental force that's always been with us, was 3,000 years later. So that's an indication of the fact that thinking changed with time. And we can see this more recently because if you look at sort of the first millennium, when the Chinese were inventing the compass and gunpowder and the astrolabe and various other things, they were also inventing new ways of telling stories. They were developing new musical forms. They were developing new artistic sides to their culture, as in painting and drawing. So every other sort of revolution, you go up through the Renaissance, you go up to even the Industrial Revolution that we call the Industrial Revolution, but actually, there were similar kinds of revolutionary things going on in the artistic side of things, as well as in technology. Now, today, we really don't have that. We have incredible technological evolutions, but what we don't really have is the equivalent in the arts. I mean, there was a little sort of bubble in the 1960s, 70s, 80s where you had what was then called pop music, and you had basically art forms that were coming out, unique art forms that were coming out of that kind of same movement, unique architectural forms. But really, since that time, the technology has been the major focus of evolution, of revolution sometimes. And that, now from um, the internet right through to where we are now, where AI is about to change the face of quite a lot of parts of our world. So, well, my point there is that the balance that exists between thinking creatively and thinking um, deductively has very much shifted towards the analytical side, towards technology based. And this has an interesting kind of slant on our space, particularly as coaches. I just want to dig in a little bit um, to explain what I mean by creative thinking. Now, I'm sure not too many of you remember what it was like when you were 3. I know I don't remember too much at that time. I certainly don't remember how I was thinking. But what we probably we have had experience with very young kids, maybe. I spent a lot of time with my grandkids since they were born. And every day they would come to me with some new thing that they discovered. And you could see them trying to fit it into their understanding of the world. They'd pick up a bar of soap and that would suddenly become a cell phone, or they'd pick up the vegetable strainer and that would be an ancient warlord's battle helmet. I mean, they went crazy when they found new stuff, and the reason they did that really was because their brain was trying to make sense of it. This new thing they'd found, where does it fit in to their world? Well, this thing's in the kitchen, but does it belong in the kitchen? And if it's in the kitchen, what do you do with it? So that is creative thinking. It's like sort of putting a new piece into a jigsaw puzzle. You've got to look at the whole picture, and you've got no box lid to look at. So it's really, your mind is very open at that point. And as we get towards adulthood, that gets eroded by our socialization, and we go more into this deductive process I was talking about before. And the consequence of that is that our creative thinking processes reduce in favor of saving time using these pre-written scripts. And one of the things that I think is crucial to know about creative thinking is that it is inherently divergent. Okay, so if you can think of sort of thinking processes a little bit like the eye, then you're looking through a wide-angle lens. And as a social scientist, if you're researching creative thinking, it's very difficult to do directly, because you can't sort of say, okay, this is something that I want you to get a bunch of people and say, tell me which is the most creative in your mind. I mean, it's a very difficult, it doesn't work, because let's say you've got a painting. Some people will actually prefer a realistic painting. Other people will prefer something that's pointillist or in some way non-realistic. So it's very difficult to do that. So what people do is to use divergent thinking tests. And typically these will be things like sort of, okay, you've got 3 minutes. I want you to come up with all the uses you can possibly think of a brick. And people will, they'll take a few seconds to kind of orient themselves, and then they'll start writing down, well, the brick can be used as a chop to stop your car from rolling back downhill. If you're a burglar, you can use it to smash a window. The brick can be put on a blanket on the beach to stop it blowing away. When you think about it, there's just lots of them. It's got a little dip in the top. We can use it as a little feed bowl for the dog when we take it on a walk. So there's lots of that. That is divergent thinking. So that is sort of well established that creativity is inherently divergent. What's not really scientifically established so much, but I think is very sort of evident, is that when you're thinking deductively or analytically, it's the opposite. It's very convergent. And you can kind of tell this just intuitively because of the phrases we use. You know, we drill down, we focus in. And basically, you can see this. I'm sure in your coaching, you have all come across people that have been around a significant stress. I mean, it might be true of like everybody you've coached. I think people don't seem to come to me when they're not stressed for some reason or other. And I don't think I'm a stress magnet. I think it's just what we do. And so one of the things that happens under stress, once again, this bit is science. This isn't Andre's shower time theory. Is seizing and freezing, and it's basically when you're under stress, it's a little bit like you're a racehorse with blinders. You find a solution to a problem, and you then cease the search for any other solutions. And once again, it's an energy conservation thing. You've got other things that are stressing you that you need to spend energy on. And so you get rid of this one decision by just, yes, okay, that's the decision I'm going to take, and I'm not going to bother to look anymore. So it's once again, that is the very antithesis of creative thinking, isn't it? Because the creative version of that would be to brainstorm it, even if you just brainstorm it amongst yourself. You'd think of all the possible options to solve this problem or address this challenge. You wouldn't necessarily, write them on sticky notes and paste them all over the kitchen wall, but you could do. But basically, that's what you would do to do it creatively. So this is quite the opposite of that. And I think you've probably seen this in your coaching, in that if somebody is under stress, and I used to coach quite a few people with burnout, so it's quite extreme, really. When the only real thing they can talk about is their burnout, the cause of their burnout, that's the consequence of their burnout, and what they're going to do about their burnout. I mean, it's all focused on the burnout. What there isn't is any view of the future. So on the one hand, you've got this convergent process where people have gone into a mode where they can only really have one focus to their thinking. And on the other hand, you have creative thinking, which is a very broad, divergent process. And I don't know if you've ever sort of, in the course of talking to people, somebody has said to you, well, when you go for a walk, um, try and look up. Look at the sky, don't look at your feet, and your mood will improve. And scientifically, people have found that that's the case. And it sort of makes sense, doesn't it? When you look up, you're seeing the sky. I mean, you're seeing sort of or more of the world. When you're staring down at your feet, your view of the world is sort of rather less comprehensive, so rather comprehensive. So, once again, it's sort of divergent versus convergent. And it's important to note that the divergent, the creative side, is actually measurably statistically likely to make you more happy. So creativity correlates with happiness. So in terms of coaching, burnout and stress and so forth, it really is a triple whammy. If you can get people to change from their convergent process to their divergent process. And one of the things that I just want to emphasize is that this is a function of different neural pathways. Okay, so I'm just going to, if you don't mind, I'm just going to share my screen. And can you see that all right? Okay, so these are both fMRI studies, and I don't know if you know anything about fMRI, but basically we all know what an MRI is, don't we? It breaks up part of your body, and you go into this horrible big machine for 10 minutes, and you get a cross section of whatever doesn't function. So fMRI is interesting in the sense that you can actually, it's functional MRI. So you can actually take a picture of what's going on in somebody's brain as they are thinking about something. And this is the brain at rest. And the parietal lobe sort of here. So this is the frontal lobe. So basically, you haven't got too much sort of going on in the main part of the brain here. Here, this is actually a composite of um, two images. These bits in blue are actually they are neural pathways. They are the that's the train of synapses all firing away when you're thinking about some specific thing. In this particular case, this along the top here is the result of somebody thinking about something creative. This is creative thinking. And the neural pathway, you can't see the other side of this, but it actually extends up into this area. But this is basically the neural pathways associated with analytical thinking. In this particular person, it's not the same in every person. I mean, there are similarities, but there are also differences. But in this particular person, you can see two very distinct differences. So it's important to sort of realize that because um, what a very, very powerful technique, if you have somebody that is kind of stuck in this groove of thinking, I mean, this is not just about stress, this can be about depression, this can be about trauma. A very powerful process is to actively try and get them to generate new neural pathways. And there may be others other than creativity, but I've been using creativity to do that. And the process has been really incredibly effective. And if it works with your client, and I've never had it not work, but I'm only talking about half a dozen clients, so this is not exactly statistically significant. But um, I, if it works, then what is nice about it is that you can use the creative thinking process as an alternative. You can trigger it when the person is going into the negative path, and they can make an active choice to start using a trigger in the creative path to change the way they're thinking. Does that sort of make sense? I mean, is all this, and is it also of interest? I don't want to sort of rabbit on if it's not. Okay. You don't have to be polite. You can tell me if it's quite enough. Um, so one of the things I just want to mention, I want to emphasize that, you know, from the bow and arrow to the spear and the wheel to the iPhone and everything, this has always been with us. And when I started researching creativity, really everything that went before in terms of research, pretty much everything, was research on an analytical basis. In other words, people would kind of say, okay, what is it? What is this creativity stuff? And they'd get a whole bunch of creative people who were sort of eminently creative in maybe architecture, maybe writing, maybe painting. I don't think they had too many painters, actually. They were a bit too off the wall for them to deal with. But anyway, they had creative people. And they stuck them in a comfortable house in California for the weekend and basically asked them a bunch of questions in the course of time. And they found absolutely nothing of use. I mean, they came up with sort of things like, well, the commonalities were they all had mentors. Duh. I mean, even people that aren't creative that have a mentor are probably quite good at what they're going to do. I mean, you know, if you're so there and a few other things that were really equally banal. So in a sense, it really disproved that creativity was the unique skill of particular special people. So what then became the question, which was the one that really I addressed in my early work and still still am addressing really, is the notion that this is an environmental phenomenon. This is about how we are associated with those people around us and what our environment is, and maybe to some extent how we were programmed as children, and so on and so forth. But it is essentially it is something that we all have the capability to have. So, and I think that's important to remember when you're coaching. And in my experience, because we've all had been creative when we were children, when we were, well, I mean, younger children, it there is something that kind of triggers in people's minds. So if you start on this path with a coaching client, it tends to be very positive because there's something that triggers in the mind that says, this feels natural. I've done this before sometime. You can slot people, but people will slot into this mode of thinking very easily. So I'm going to pause there and just ask you if you've got any questions and how this is landing with you.
It's very interesting for me. I'll jump in. I've done a lot of work around just being trauma informed in the past year and a half, and I've learned how trauma causes our prefrontal cortex to shut down, and our amygdala is overactive, and with that we do lose a lot of creativity, a lot of fun, a lot of joy. So I'm curious to how you do bring this in with your clients. Do you give them specific things to do? Are you letting them decide what their creative um, tools are? So can you share maybe some of the things that you've done with your clients?
Yeah, I think there are two paths that I use. One is in the very early discussions with a client. I mean, maybe even the discovery call. I'll explore if they've ever done anything in their life that is creative. So, did you ever take photographs? Did you ever sort of do any, videoing, or did you keep a journal? Have you ever drawn or painted, or is there a musical instrument that you've ever felt attached to? That kind of thing. So as a very general kind of give me some idea if they've ever been exposed to what we think of as creative thinking. But then during the course of all this, one of the things, one of the things I really like to do, if it kind of falls naturally into place, is to talk about meditation. Right? I mean, that for me is just a no-brainer because that helped me so much when I had burnout 40 years ago now. And so that was really that's interestingly, I didn't show it at that time, but the neural pathways that light up when people are meditating, not new meditators, but people that already have meditated, those neural pathways are very similar to creative thinking neural pathways. And so, and that sort of kind of makes intuitive sense to me because meditation is it's tends to be the opposite to focus, doesn't it?
Hmm.
I mean, you're deliberately defocusing in many ways to
Right.
let whatever comes in come in. So it sort of makes sense to me. But yeah, so that, and sometimes things will just happen naturally. I mean, one of my clients had mentioned he was very keen on videography, and in our about session number 3, I was kind of getting a little tired of we go in there and basically he's talking about his trauma and his grief, trauma and grief. Well, that's fine. That's what I'm there for. But I'm also there to try and help him. So, when we when he sort of stopped the initial conversation about his, I said, tell me a little bit more about the videography that you used to do. He told me he was, keen, used to do a lot of videography. And, he was, it took him by surprise that I suddenly would, come out with that. But he started to talk to me a little bit about that. I used to do weddings and blah, blah, blah. And so I set him the task. I said, well, just between now and when we next meet, just set yourself the goal of making a short video for me. I'd like to see the kind of stuff you did. And it was incredible. I mean, the next session, the first 10 minutes was the usual kind of, well, it's been, I was very depressed. Blah, blah, blah. And then I said, well, what did you manage to do any of the videography? And really, within 10 minutes of that, the whole game had changed. I mean, he said, yeah, I did. And a friend of his was doing a track meet, which he videoed. And he said, yeah, in fact, he was going to edit the video and give it to his friend who had a birthday coming up in a few weeks' time. And he was just the whole demeanor changed. I mean, the whole energy changed, everything changed. And and that's really where I started to investigate the whole neural pathway thing, because this was such a distinct change. And so we then started to work on ways that he could um, trigger that creative pathway. And so for him, it was, well, when you start to think about your friend, and I didn't, his friend who'd committed suicide, was I didn't want him to block those memories out of his mind. So let's agree that the goal here is that you will be able to think about your friend with all the good stuff that you shared together coming up, rather than the tragedy of his death. And so, if and so let those thoughts come up. But if you start to find that you're dwelling on the tragedy of his death, then have something in mind for your next video, and just literally segue into that. And it was just very, very successful. Um, Now, with him, I'd also kind of led him in the sort of direction of creative thinking by saying, we agreed he would go on a walk for half an hour every day, and we session, the session after that, we'd kind of um, uh, combine the two. So I said, during your walk, keep your eyes open for something that might be interesting for you to photograph. And it transpired he was a very good uh, artist. I mean, he drew some incredible things, and so next time he came, he showed me a drawing he'd done, but he just walked to the park. And then something in the park caught his eye, and he'd been drawing these people in the park. It was exceptionally good. So it's never been particularly difficult to get. I mean, some people really do. They're adamant that they're not creative. So then I just kind of slide into it through. Um, well, if you're going to go for a walk, then take a little notebook with you. I'd be interested to know what kinds of things you're going to see on the walk. And so you kind of slip it in that way. And they're doing something creative, even though they're totally certain that they've nothing, not a creative bone in their body. So there's always ways of kind of, getting creative thinking into that. And it's always quite a dramatic shift in their thinking, which I think is the sort of important bit. How do you see that? Do you see that has possibilities in your work?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. And then I think I do to some degree like that, but I was just kind of curious how you kind of incorporate that into it. If you are educating them on it, and are they aware that they are actually creating new neural pathways?
Yes,
Hmm.
yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
And
cool.
most
I
of the
like
time
that.
people are pretty fascinated by the
I
process.
agree. I agree.
But it's
That's how I learned myself, is understanding, the science behind it. So I was kind of just curious your approach to it.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, absolutely. How's that landing with you? I know you missed the beginning of it, Gary, but how's that landing with you?
Dr. Andre, I absolutely eat this stuff up. I have long identified myself as a creative. So This I can liken this immediately to things like art therapy as a way to, and I'm also simultaneously in the middle of a NLP course to become an NLP practitioner, and there's so many tie-ins, obviously, that you're aware of here with the language of the subconscious and how there are these neural pathways built that we're so not conscious of. So yeah, my mind is a buzz right now as I create these metaphors for like how we're truly thinking. The idea of the divergent thinking test, where you give someone a brick and you're like, all right, what do you do with this? Infinite amount of questions you can ask someone who's stuck in the cycle of like, they're only looking for that survival impulses. Like and I was actually talking to Kathy about this, which is kind of crazy this morning. Um, how when you're stuck in this stress pattern or this dysregulated state, it becomes I think the example that I gave Kathy was like being stuck out to sea and you know that you can't paddle for forever. And the only thing you need in that moment are one of two things, or maybe a third if you think a life raft, but immediately a rope, a life preserver, a life raft, anything to get you out of that, but you're singularly focused on just this solving for the one thing. But oftentimes the solution is coming back to present, finding your safety, bringing down, all of the red flags, that fight or flight, and coming back to like, okay, can I create some expansiveness here and maybe carve out some new neural pathways where I can not just start to think creatively, but like find these massively creative solutions that are it's crazy. It's just how it all stitches together. I'm super inspired and grateful that you're walking us through the neurology behind it too.
Thank you. Yeah, it's the neurology stuff was powerful for me because my first book was published in 2011, and that was, there was really no new fMRI for any kind of research purposes, and so a lot of my kind of theories about creativity there were really just sort of from observation and from bits of social science research. But then when fMRI came out, and it's like sort of, these distinct neural pathways. And um, by the way, for anybody that doesn't know, it's fMRI that debunked the idea that the left brain is logical and the right brain is, artistic. That was debunked in sort of 20, I don't know, 2014, 2015 by the workers at Utah University. And, so it's that was kind of interesting. But, to see these patterns light up in a distinct way was very powerful. Well, it really kind of propelled me on to extend my work into that area. Because, I mean, ultimately, I think, we all need a balance of these two ways of thinking. My half sister, who's she spent her life as an artist, and I wasn't brought up with my father, but she was, and my father was a world-renowned artist. And even, I mean, she's 90. She goes out to a painting, thing, and she'll pack the car with very specific things. I mean, she needs this, she needs that, she needs this, and then there's a homemade thing here that needs to be in there, and blah blah blah. And she's got, I mean, her whole car is absolutely jam packed full of very specific things that she knows exactly that need to be there. And then off she'll go, sometimes for weeks or months, and then she'll come back with paintings. And but the analytical side, if she didn't have the analytical side switched on, she wouldn't have the right things in the car. And it's a bit, it's the parallel I use is I have a friend that's a sculptor, and if he gets the idea that he wants to do a particular kind of piece of sculpture, it might be, and I want it, I really want it in pink, so I want to use Tennessee marble, and then but I can't use Tennessee marble for this because it's too fragile. You chip it and it breaks along the lines rather than doing what I want it to do. So to get the result that he needs, he's got to have that analytical deductive part as well. and so it's a balance. And there's a third factor that comes into all this, which is structure. And we all need structure. Artists need structure, technologists need structure. We all need structure in our lives. And there is a scale called the need for structure scale. And that comes in, that's important because sometimes people who are very creative become they have the idea that they don't need structure, and that structure, in fact, they reject structure. They actively reject structure, and that can have devastating effects. If you ever anybody here coached anybody that's highly creative, it can be very tough because that need for structure is something that they actively reject. And you can kind of see this if you look at the artistic groups of the 20s. The I can't remember the name of those groups now, but they had sort of philosophers and writers and artists and so forth. And every now and again the group will get smaller because one of them has decided that they want to end it all, or they just do something staggeringly stupid, or whatever it is. But so that need for structure is something that we can have, but it doesn't have to get in the way of creativity. But it can do. I mean, there are certain types of structure. I mean, social structure can easily get in the way of creativity because when we all need groups, for instance. I mean, we have this well-established need for groups that were been with us since we were living in caves. I mean, safety in numbers is not just a cliche. I mean, it's a reality. And so the trouble is that when we're in a group, our minds are focused on our similarity with others. I mean, you, for instance, Gary, the weekend, when you put your leathers on and you go down to the Harley Davidson meet, local, it's a similarity with everybody else in that group that is in your mind. That's your focus. But when we're being creative, it's quite the opposite. We have to be. It is our difference from others that is poignant, because it is. If we thought as other people thought, we wouldn't be creative. We would simply be being repetitive of everything that's out there, which is sort of definition of madness, isn't it, really? But it's so these two are at opposite ends of the spectrum. When we're being groupy, we basically are trying to be similar. When we're being creative, we're trying to be dissimilar. And if we want to spend a lot of our time being creative and dissimilar, if we haven't got other ways of finding structure, then we can, definitely lose it. I mean, one of the anomalous things here is, on one hand, being creative is associated with happiness. On the other hand, people who are creative have a higher chance of having psychological disorders. I mean, myself, when my mother was institutionalized when I was 7, but I don't think that was anything about creativity. I think that was about the fact that we didn't fit in. She didn't fit in. And I think not fitting in can really cause you to pay a high price, because you're not getting that groupiness that we're all programmed to need. So there is sort of at those kind of extremes there are anomalies, and sometimes I've had a couple of clients who were really racked with guilt because they knew they needed time on their own to be creative, to go in both cases it was painting, and they felt very guilty because that meant that to some degree, in some way, they were rejecting their family, rejecting their kids, they were rejecting their partner. They were both women, so it was rejecting their husbands. And so just a simple act of explaining how normal this is, if you're highly creative, was a great relief in both cases. And in both cases, we just worked out, look, how about just talking about this with your family and say, look, I really getting into my painting. I really need a little bit of time on my own to be doing that. And in all cases, it was great. Everybody said, yeah, fine, go for it. What you don't need to ask. I mean, just and so it was a happy conclusion all the way around. But that introduction of guilt as a function of sort of just wanting own time um, was really the cause of the issue. So there are lots and lots of moving parts in this whole process, but I think you hit on really one of the key ones, which is this convergence and divergence. And then the other key one is this conflict between needing others and needing absence from others. So I need the group, now I don't need the group. And a lot of creative people get around the the group thing by having other creative people in their group. So in other words, if there's a creative you don't fit in, which is quite common, creative people often have a very loose connection with social norms, and so a lot of other people don't like that too much. And so if you tend not to fit in, then your group could comprise a whole bunch of other people that don't fit in, and then they're never going to criticize you for not fitting in. So, and you see that quite a lot. I mean, the Bloomsbury set, it was the people that's the group I was thinking of in the 20s in England. Very, very famous writers, philosophers, painters, and God knows what all else. Well, I mean, if you saw the kind of life that they led, you would certainly say, yes, okay, this is not the usual social normic kind of existence. But because they were all, had their own individual ways of rejecting social norms, they created a group which supplied that groupiness. But I don't think there's anything much else that I can add to that conversation. Any other questions? No. Well, I hope you found that of use, and it was a bit wasn't as well structured as perhaps it could have been. I've just all over the show this morning with various things going on, and
No, it's a lot of information. It's good. I enjoyed it. So thank you
good,
for that.
good. I'm glad you did. Well, thank you very much for enjoying
Thank
it.
you, Andre. Yes. And, let us know about your continued research with this, because it'd be interesting to see as you start to gather more clients and take them through this, what you notice, the trends and things like that.
Yeah, and do if you get to apply some of these ideas in your coaching, do please put it in the chat or let me know personally or whatever. I would always very as a social scientist, I don't like sort of one or two of something. It doesn't prove anything. But for a bunch of people, something's useful. But it's just it's just very interesting to know if people find it. I think one of the things that I really have enjoyed in integrating this into my coaching is that it has really overcome sort of some of those awkward, quiet times when you're really trying not to say too much, and the client decides they're not going to say too much either, and it gives you a positive, pertinent way of kind of introducing another topic to move everything ahead. In other words, it can be quite easy to sort of fall into going round in a circle, can't it? Sometimes it can be very difficult, I think, to really focus on a concrete way forward with a client. You don't want to be too, you don't want to be pushy, you don't want to be too guiding. You just well, guiding, at some level, but not too aggressively, and so on and so forth. And somehow getting involved in their creative thinking processes gets around some of that.
Mm.
I mean, you're basically, talking about something that is very positive, and something that a lot of people don't think very much about. So just the fact that they're thinking about that process can be a powerful stimulant to actually changing the way
Mm.
that they're
And
thinking.
as with anything else, when we're learning something new, it's not like an immediate response, right? We see it over time with building a new habit of using that part of your brain. Um, I was just going to ask you a question because I see a lot of people with nervous system dysregulation, anxiety. So I'm working with people who struggling with who are struggling with the divergent. They're convergent. They're in that narrow tunnel vision. So when somebody came to you with, like, say, struggling to make a decision, even something small, like
Yeah.
what's for dinner, like um anything come up for you with that question? Like, I'm curious if you have any tools or tips on working with somebody who does even struggle to just make simple little decisions like that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because it's yes, I have seen that. And I mean, what would come up for me is that they need to be encouraged to, sort of step back a little bit. I mean, it
Mm-hmm.
sounds to me as if that person has probably got too many influences
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
on the issue in question. So, the what should we have for dinner might be a physical function of, what have I got in the larder, but also a sort of, an interpersonal function as to the fact that, oh, the kid doesn't, that kid doesn't eat sprouts, and that one doesn't eat that, and my husband doesn't like fish, and so I mean, there can be, issues that are sort of wrapped up in, once again, they could be even, there could be a sort of element of guilt that fits into some
Mm-hmm.
of the
Mm-hmm.
answers. You don't want
Yeah,
to.
I know. I've read a lot of that is like also the fear of making the wrong decision, or like so. But I was just kind of curious, like in that moment when somebody actually like really needs to make a decision, how to kind of like, I liked what you just said as far as just like kind of pulling them out of it. But it is interesting. It's something I hear often, to tell you the truth, the whole decision making thing, which then of course then creates more anxiety because it's like, you know,
Yes, yes,
go ahead.
absolutely. I
Yeah.
mean, I think people with burnout can have a lot of difficulty making decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when you think about it, when you think about it, decision making really is a function of information and skill.
Mm-hmm.
If the two come together, then making the decisions fairly easy. But if they don't, and in the case of people with burnout, because they're so kind of blinkered in their view of the world, they literally can't kind of get into
Yeah.
the position that's appropriate to do that. I'm also a great believer in uh, in the idea that there's a time to make decisions and the time isn't, and there's a time not to. I've had people beating themselves up over procrastination, the issue of
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
procrastination, and I know from I spent 15 years as an entrepreneur, and building two of my inventions to become global leaders in their field. I mean, I was my business has really took up all my time thinking, but they also, they really grew. So that some of the decisions were not trivial, and I think it's quite frequent that we're pushed into making a decision without enough information. And if you have to make the decision, you have to make the decision. Some decisions are like that, you know. But if you feel that you haven't got the data you need to make the decision, then I think you should then ask yourself, do I actually have to make that decision now?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I have, in other people's eyes, procrastinated over decisions in my business. And then, a few weeks later, the need to make that decision has, for some reason, disappeared altogether. And not making that decision was just fine because, making the decision might indeed have had negative consequences. I think more often or not, though, out of the arena of work, and maybe even in the arena of work, making decisions are intimately connected with the people that you're with, your family
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
or your working people, your colleagues at work. And I think that there are so many things that can get introduced into that. I mean, so if I decide something in this direction, then I'm going to piss that person off. If I decide in that direction, I'm going to upset that person. And I mean, it can be enormously complicated. And I think most people will, who can make those sorts of decisions, when they're sort of when they're grounded and mentally strong, they haven't got burnout, they haven't got anything else
Mm-hmm.
going on, then it's not going to take very much stress for that decision to suddenly become complicated. It can be very, very straightforward when we're all strong and just feel that we can tackle anything in the world. But then a few things go wrong, and suddenly decision making is one of the things that goes with it. And that's certainly true under stress, and that brings us back to that seizing and freezing phenomenon. And then you've got the issue of, that's the solution that I want to seize on. But if that's not the right solution, then I'm doing myself an injustice. So maybe I shouldn't make the decision. And, I mean, there's all sorts of things that can tie you in knots at that point. But I think just being aware of the fact that stress is interfering with your decision making is the first thing, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
If you're aware of that. I mean, no,
Right.
if I've got a cold or flu, I try not to make any decisions because I know that my brain is not working as well as it would do.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, generally speaking, just fine. But, so being aware of the fact that, okay, I'm
Mm-hmm.
under stress, I've got to be really careful. And that's something I go through with burnout clients. This is one of the things with burnout is, we people with burnout almost inevitably reject those people around them who are the very people that could help. So, it's they will basically try and stay away from their family. Doesn't see them very much. Decreasing amounts as they get more and more burnout. The people at work. You no longer sort of go and have a coffee with them or drink after work or whatever. I mean, you suddenly,
Yeah.
and in the extreme, you can find burnout people that have really, especially if they work at home, that they haven't left home for the last 2 weeks. All their recreations have been fallen off the side of the cliff. They've managed to get rid of their partner, go and spend time with the parents or something.
Mm-hmm.
And
Be-
they're
be-
just left really to cope on their own, whereas all those people could help them.
Before we wrap, Diana dropped a question that said, I don't know if you saw it in the chat, but
Oh,
she
right.
asked, Dr. Andre, based on your research and experience, do you think all beings are creative?
Do I think, where's the question?
Do you think all beings are creative?
All beings.
Correct.
Well, I think all human beings have the potential to be creative. Yes, I do think that. Sorry, I didn't see a question, Diana. I beg your pardon. Yeah, I absolutely do think that. And I think, to be fair, I think there is a difference between doing something creative and thinking creatively. If you're doing something creative, then you not only require the creative thinking, but you require skills, don't you? require very specific skills. I mean, you can think as creatively as you like, but it doesn't mean to say you can pick up a chisel and make a beautiful piece of sculpture. I mean, you've got all the skill related stuff that's got to creep in there. But in principle, I do think everybody has the capacity to think creatively, because we all did it. We all did it as kids. That's the only way our brain had to make sense of our world when we were 1, 2, 3, 4 years old, was creative thinking. So that's why I believe that.
Dr. Andre, I wanted to say lastly, really quick, if you don't mind. I feel like this is just our coaching session, and I don't know who these other people are who have joined us, but it's so entirely inspiring, and I love your work. Just that point you made about decision making, I was immediately thinking about improv work. How, people that do improv, the fundamental thing in improv is to ask and I think often most of us humans will ask ourselves A or B. And it's basically creating a dilemma, isn't it? Like it's just
Yes.
like, all right, well, that just stressed me out more versus the idea of how children play, to your point. It's limitless potential and options that we create, where it's like not just this or that, it's this and this and this and this and this and this.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
it's just a really, really wonderful way to reframe getting out of a mode of just that contraction of stress and anxiety that us adults do really, really well. But yeah, I'm just such a massive fan, and I just want to say thanks again for all of this.
I think I think that's a great point. I think that's a great well. One last point I would just make is, if as adults we can really experience that more of that childhood way of thinking, when we plunge ourselves into an environment that is totally new and totally different. I'm a culture junkie. I've lived and worked in 7 different countries, and I remember the first time I went to India. It's we got the bags, at the airport, and I mean the first thing was that there's a person in a uniform standing next to a little traffic light and a button, and they tell you've got to come, you the passenger, you've got to come and push that button. And when you push that button, that either the light goes red or the light goes green. If it goes red, you get your stuff searched. If it's green, you go outside. I thought, that's clever. They're making the point that there's no profiling going on. And I didn't know if this was a hangover from the caste system or what, but basically they're saying, whatever color it is, it was you that did it. I thought it was kind of neat. And then went out, got in the taxi. Within about 10 minutes, we're going along and we're driving next to an elephant. And it's just, I mean, I've seen elephants in the zoo, and Indian taxis at that time were really very small little vehicles. And you're driving along, and really all you can see is this huge grey knee that you're driving past. And the elephant's not taking any notice of us at all. I mean, but things, every day for the next month, there's something there that I'm thinking, wow, that's an interesting way of doing it, but it seems to work. But in that space, your brain is like a 5-year-old, 4-year-old, 3-year-old. You're looking at everything and you're trying to make sense of this new world. It's that. I think that's the adult version of that sort of childhood phenomenon of sort of, what is this thing anyway? That kind of thing. And it's just it happens to be something that I really really enjoy. I mean, it's just I just feel it sort of adds so much to one's way of looking at the world somehow. But thank you very much for your comment, and thank you.
Thank you. It's a great topic, and we could talk about this stuff all day long.
Well, you guys have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, Andre. Appreciate it.
Thanks very much again.
Bye bye.